Presentation in our 6-module series in the Build a Clinic program on key components of implementing tobacco-free policies, including tobacco cessation services and supports. My name is Jim Pavlik, and I'm the Program and Policy Analyst at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Today we'll be talking about best practices regarding tailoring care to bridge cultural divides and thereby build rapport and increase the chances that the advice and services we extend are accepted in the best possible light. Before we get too far along, I wanted to take a minute to do a bit of housekeeping. For those of you who have attended previous Build a Clinic webinars, you'll remember we have switched to a computer and internet-only webinar format. With just a few technical glitches so far, this has worked out really well. Thank you so much to those who chatted in their questions and participated in our follow-up evaluations. Please take a moment to mute your computer's microphone. This significantly improves sound quality for all listeners, as the computer tends to clip or alter the audio when it thinks someone else is about to speak. If you do accidentally close out or get kicked off during the webinar, simply re-access the link in the confirmation email you received and rejoin us as rapidly as possible. Please send in your questions as you think of them using the chat functionality built into the webinar software. I will do what I can to pay attention to questions as they come in, and if it's relevant at that time, I will answer it. Otherwise, expect I will do so at the end. In any case, if you need clarification, extra resources, even if you disagree with something I've said, please send us a chat message and we will respond to it. At the end of the presentation, we will open it up for Q&A. And I have one final note before going on. I use two terms throughout this presentation, clinician and client. By clinician, I mean anyone with direct client contact who is explicitly performing an intervention or is otherwise trying to evoke positive health behavior change in a client. And by client, I'm referring to what your agency may call a client, patient, or a consumer. Today's presentation is the 5th in a 6-module series covering the knowledge and skills practices need to know to efficiently and effectively integrate tobacco cessation services and supports into the current clinical workflows, with a special emphasis on serving underserved populations. These webinars have been and will continue taking place monthly. The first webinar covered the 5 A's, a clinically proven best practice used to move clients through the stages of change, motivate their quit attempts, and remain abstinent longer. In the second webinar, we discussed pharmacotherapy options. Combined, these first 2 presentations provided the basic skills necessary to begin treating nicotine dependence right away. For the third webinar, we returned to counseling with an in-depth look at the use of motivational interviewing within the 5 A's framework. In the fourth webinar, the University of Colorado Department of Family Medicine discussed how tobacco cessation fits into a typical clinical workflow to find low-burden ways to integrate tobacco cessation interventions into existing practices. Today, we introduce the whys and hows of tailoring tobacco cessation interventions for populations specifically targeted by the tobacco industry and by those populations that, although maybe not specifically targeted, tend to lack the preponderance of services that frequently lead to more successful quit attempts. This presentation will focus on cultural sensitivity and how the use of pre-established protocols combined with motivational interviewing can make clinicians more adaptive in the face of our increasingly more diverse and ever-shifting populations. In next month's final webinar, we will look at the internal and external resources that can be brought to bear on this new program so as to create a sustainable culture of wellness. Today's webinar is not an introduction to cultural sensitivity, nor an appeal for you to adopt an attitude of cultural awareness. Rather, it is assumed that listeners have already bought into the notion that providing care in such a manner is the correct thing to do, and listeners are hoping to learn new information and to obtain some strategies to implement it. It is also assumed that listeners are familiar with both the 5 A's and motivational interviewing. At the very least, it is assumed you have already attended the Build a Clinic webinars on those topics. Having said that, most of the webinar will be entirely comprehensible without having done so, but if you need further explanation about those 2 topics, please refer to those videos. The first 4 webinars in the series are already available as videos on our YouTube channel. You can access them easily by visiting our website, bhwellness.org, look under the Materials tab, and then select Build a Clinic Materials. Today's webinar, like all Build a Clinic webinars, will be available on that page 2 weeks from the broadcast date. Those of you who have attended previous Build a Clinic webinars have already heard my brief bio, but today I want to expand on it a bit to give you a little more detail about why the Behavioral Health and Wellness program moved me from a purely moderator role into the role of today's presenter. I received undergraduate degrees in Spanish and international studies and eventually obtained my master's in international relations. I've worked as a community advocate and activist primarily in Indianapolis' Hispanic community. In that role, I connected new immigrants to community resources and instructed them how to advocate for themselves. I also worked at the same time as an interpreter and translator for a legal clinic. Eventually, I moved to Tucson, Arizona, where I was an in-home case aide at a large community behavioral health center. In that capacity, I worked primarily with African American, Native American, and Hispanic families. In the case of the latter, my clients were children, all of which spoke English as a first language, but I also worked with their older siblings, their parents, and in some cases their grandparents, aunts, uncles, step-parents, etc. As one moved up the family tree, the likelihood that I would spend part of my time speaking in Spanish grew, and I always worked with the children in their communities, in their schools, and in their homes. So that's a really long way of prepping you for this comment. Despite 15 years working with Hispanic and Latino individuals, families, and communities, I'm not particularly culturally competent. And that leads me to my first critical point. I'm not here today to talk about cultural competence. If you haven't attended a cultural competence training before, you might be expecting a quick rundown of the major cultural themes that run through certain demographic groups, a list of facts like, in Japan, blue is a color of mourning, or in Middle Eastern countries, the polite social distance to maintain during a conversation is considered uncomfortably close in American society. The word competency implies that if someone has memorized several dozen lists like this, then they've crossed some sort of finish line. Take a few courses, take part in some continuing education sessions, take a few online quizzes, and voila, there they are, 100% culturally competent. Rather, what I want to speak about today is not cultural competency, but cultural humility. Or better yet, I want to talk about the motivational interviewing heart set and how adopting the empathetic modality emphasized in motivational interviewing is a way of approximating cultural competency in a world where learning about every potential client's cultural heritage in depth is increasingly impossible. That's not to say that learning specific traits of specific cultures isn't important. It is. But if we think of cultural competency as having two distinct modes, one is simple knowledge of a list of attributes and attitudes commonly held between members of specific cultural groups, and the other is adopting the right attitudes in regard to openness to differences and respect for others' humanity, the latter is the far more broadly applicable, and thus the focus of today's webinar. The four objectives of today's webinar are to discuss cultural sensitivity, review prevalence and patterns of tobacco use for priority populations briefly, discuss treatment strategies to improve the health for populations with disparate health outcomes, and to discuss strategies that healthcare clinicians and the agencies they work for can adopt to diminish implicit biases. But before we talk about how we can ensure that we are adequately taking cultural differences into consideration in the care we provide, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about why we care. And I think I can summarize that with 2 quick points. First is that this is a big deal. For a host of reasons, several groups in the United States have higher prevalence rates of smoking, lower success rates quitting, and different access to treatment for the various conditions that tobacco use causes and, as a result, significantly poorer outcomes. And point 2 is that culturally tailored interventions work. They work to increase successful quit attempts and thus prevent the development of those conditions and thus decrease the health disparities between these groups and the general population. So let's talk about what we mean when we say culture. Culture is one of those squishy words, and anyone who has ever attempted to talk about it has also attempted a definition. All of them, and mine will be no exception, leave us wanting. I'll try to be as specific as is reasonable without unduly pinning us to a definition that is too limiting. First of all, when we think of disparities, we think of several groups, like those depicted on this slide. Certain occupations, so-called blue-collar jobs, have higher prevalence rates and worse health outcomes. Low-income groups do as well. And in many cases, we can talk about the cultures of these groups, for example, of youth culture or military culture. Or we can talk about the generational cultures of millennials versus baby boomers. We can talk about the cultures of the Mountain West versus the Deep South. Or we can talk about the culture of machismo in Hispanic Latino culture, which is, by definition, gender-based. Culture is the behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and values that are held at least somewhat in common between individuals that share a language, a religion, and or a geopolitical history. We often think in terms of capital D demographic groups, Hispanic Latino, Asian, Native American, and African American, and it is on these areas that I'll be focusing on today. Culture shapes what we do and how we think, not just about those around us, but also ourselves. As a result, it has a potential impact on when and why someone initiates tobacco use. It may play a role in how many cigarettes a day one smokes, as well as who's allowed to smoke and who isn't. Thus, if someone, a mother, for example, smokes, Culture may add to the stigma that this mother feels, which raises her stress levels, which encourages her to persist in her smoking patterns. We see this precise dynamic with our peer groups in Utah. The very stress of smoking as a Mormon youth has such a stigma attached to it that the youth persist in their smoking behavior to treat the stress caused by their smoking. Culture also influences who will try to quit, when, and how. Culture also plays a role in relapse. For example, sacred use of tobacco among some Native American groups can be particularly troublesome, as the ceremonial use can be the precursor incident causing a relapse to daily use of commercial tobacco. The bottom line is that culturally and linguistically appropriate care is better quality care, which leads to better health for clients in populations with significant health disparities and at a lower cost. That is, making sure that the advice and services we offer is presented in a way that is respectful of the client's culture helps us achieve the elusive triple aim. While being mindful and respectful of cultural differences can assist clinicians' success getting clients to agree to any treatment regimen, I'm of the opinion that this is of particular importance when health behavioral change is central, as it is with tobacco cessation. To successfully motivate change and to inspire the level of client self-care required, a clinician has to be particularly aware of things that cultural blindness obscures. Spending time with our clients and ensuring that we understand precisely what is wrong and what their goals are concerning their treatment can mean the difference between ordering an expensive test or not. Or in our case, it can mean finding the values that might lead to a quit attempt or in creating a wall of resistance. It can mean finding the narrative that will lead to persistence in a quit attempt or having the client abandon their treatment plan. Or to say it another way, culturally tailored tobacco cessation services work better in populations with health disparities. So what are these disparities? One thing to note is that the disparities are not always evident simply in prevalence rates. In fact, when we look at race and ethnicity, we can see that African American, Hispanic, and Asian populations all have lower rates than white populations do, and all of them are below the general population figure as well, and in the case of Asian tobacco users, much lower. For these groups, we see two things. One is that many clinicians do not have the education or training they need to tailor their care in such a way to encourage quit attempts or motivate their clients to engage in the intervention and successfully quit. However, as we shall see, such tailoring can have a big impact. Many of these groups have a deeper mistrust of authority, especially to government officials and medical professionals. In a recent study of African Americans in the Mississippi River Delta, where the memories of the Tuskegee experiment still linger, several respondents of a survey reported distrusting the quit line. A similar distrust exists among many Native American tobacco users. So in addition to inadequate materials and protocols to help non-majority tobacco users to quit, there are barriers that prevent them from seeking care in the first place. Among some members of some groups, there's also a sense that their care clinicians just aren't like them, don't understand them and their particular life experiences. While this acts as a barrier to seeking care, it also acts as a barrier to developing the kind of rapport and trust needed for the client to be influenced by the clinician's advice and to keep the client engaged in the massive daily effort needed to overcome nicotine dependence. When we do see increased prevalence rates, the two major culprits are believed to be the marketing that targeted these groups specifically and the fact that racial discrimination in general, and also the kinds of specific discrimination that limits jobs, housing, schooling, and training opportunities, all add to the daily stressors of life. And stress, across all groups, routinely shows up among the top reasons that people use tobacco or relapse back into tobacco use. In addition to the barriers to seeking care and barriers to complying with care, other factors we need to consider are that many individuals in these disparate groups simply do not have convenient access to care. This is especially true of those living in rural, medically underserved, or clinician shortage areas, but it's equally true for those that simply do not have access to reliable transportation, as is often the case in low-income communities. And poverty is a cross-cutting issue across many of these communities that we are concerned with. They may be unaware that they have access to cessation treatment, especially since for many individuals this is a relatively new benefit, arriving only after the Affordable Care Act. These individuals may have more confusion about which tobacco cessation treatments are available and how to use them correctly. And critically, where we can make the most difference, they're simply less likely to receive the advice to quit and the accompanying education about how to quit and why. There are no first impressions. Now, I think this line, used by other diversity trainers, is perhaps overstating the case a bit, but it's an interesting notion to consider. Everyone we meet dresses a certain way, looks a certain way, talks a certain way, worships a certain god, set of gods, or refuses to worship altogether. Our culture and its various social groups and thought leaders have created for each of us a set of examples, prior influences on what we should come to expect from someone based on their appearance. This is such a common feature of the human habit, and one that so frequently results in inaccurate conclusions, that we have aphorisms to help correct that behavior in us. Don't judge a book by its cover. Entire fables like the ugly duckling are found in the notion that we should correct this basic heuristic. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not so prideful to believe that this webinar can succeed where the ugly duckling has failed. The truth is, there's a lot of relatively new research into proving what many of us have long suspected, that even the best intentioned of us carry with us implicit biases against members of groups that we are not members of, regardless of whether these are racial, religious, national, political groups, or any other kind. In fact, a lot of this research focuses on experiments where the groups in question are entirely arbitrary, entirely made up for the purposes of the experiment. Group cohesion and basic in-group, out-group cognitive structures are deeply rooted in likely adaptive modes of thinking. Now, a lot of this research has also found that the magnitude of the effect of implicit biases can be diminished with either exposure to the bias against group and or with practice. For purposes of our conversation, I want you to be merely aware that implicit biases exist. Some of the strategies for more culturally tailored care presented here are not meant to eradicate or even diminish those implicit biases. They are meant to diminish the effect of those biases on the health outcomes of our clients. But please don't take that as a rationale to fake it till you make it. Several of the strategies here are in fact focused on helping the clinician alter their own behaviors, attitudes, and thoughts that might perpetuate a culturally disparate environment. More than that, the following strategies would be beneficial even in treatment environments that already have a self-perpetuating culture of acceptance and partnership across cultural groups. I want to spend the second half of this webinar discussing specific things that clinics and clinicians can do to address culturally related differences in the provision of care. It is important to discuss and think critically about differences between racial and ethnic groups given the potential impact on health behaviors, particularly tobacco use. Research has indicated that knowledge about the variation among groups is important to inform cessation treatment. And tobacco cessation treatment for specific races and ethnicities is no different than what is recommended for the general population in terms of its overarching set of evidence-based practices, including the 5 A's. With these populations, as with the general population, it is important to conduct a thorough assessment, planning, and education on the risks of continued tobacco use and on the benefits of quitting. Be sure to ask questions and tailor treatment to each individual and empower people so they believe they can quit. But the first thing we must acknowledge is that, consciously or not, many clinicians have exhibited preferential treatment regarding who gets asked if they are a tobacco user and who gets advice to quit, with many racial and ethnic groups on the short end of those statistics. And as always, please don't take that as an accusation. I'm merely reporting what we find in the literature. So the first strategy here is to implement culturally neutral protocols with firm benchmarks against which performance can be measured and potential disparities discovered. And naturally, the first protocol I would like to see treatment settings adopt is the 5 A's. In addition to being an evidence-based clinical protocol shown repeatedly to increase both quit attempts generally and successful quit attempts as well, when teamed up with electronic health records or other accountability-creating mechanisms, the 5 A's creates plenty of measurable data against which discrepancies in the provision of care between groups can be measured. If a treatment setting simply sets a benchmark for the percentage of clients that are asked at each visit whether they are a tobacco user or not, then at regular intervals it can measure its clinicians' compliance with that standard. If it is determined that with regularity certain groups are asked at lower rates, then this discrepancy can be addressed. Similarly, a benchmark for who is advised to quit and who is not should be put into place. Simple binary or percentage-based outcomes are a bit more complicated for the assess and assist phases, as well as for the refer phase if it's the 2 A's in an R model that's being followed. Assess and assist are important phases where motivational interviewing often comes into play, and with that, a natural variance between clients. Simply measuring that assessment or assistance took place might be less revealing than, for example, how long this phase took, and whether the clinician successfully moved the client along the spectrum of change. However, clinics may choose to incorporate certain binary measures that should take place during these phases. For example, during assessment, the clinician could assess dependence using a simple instrument like the Fagerstrom test for nicotine dependence or the heavy smoking index. During assessment, the client's stage of change could be recorded, and if the client shifts along the spectrum of change, this could be noted as well. During assist, whether the client sets a quit date might be recorded. If the client was provided a phone and a private space to make their first quit line call, that could be recorded. If a client is referred to other services, identifying specifically what those services are could also be recorded. Finally, during a range, the length of time between the client's visit and the follow-up visit or phone call could be recorded. Here again, the treatment agency should set a benchmark, for example, within 2 weeks or the day before the client's quit date. Variation against this benchmark can be analyzed for differences between groups. As previously mentioned, when applicable, clients should be provided educational and instructional materials tailored for their cultural and linguistic groups. As of 2010, researchers were still saying that research into culturally sensitive interventions was still in its infancy. And that was true, and largely remains true today. There are a few limitations that we should note here. One is that study designs tend to be mixed. Some of the literature on the subject will test all culturally tailored interventions within a specific treatment area, like tobacco cessation, for example. Some will narrow some, but not all the way. For example, tobacco cessation interventions for all Asian Americans. And still others will focus a bit more on specific groups, like Chinese Americans. But even when a group is narrowed down, there's always the risk that regional differences are important. So qualitative results from a survey of African Americans in Arkansas's Mississippi Delta region might not be generalizable to African American communities in other areas. There's also the case that what constitutes culturally tailored is a variable. And if success and failure of a culturally tailored intervention depends on how well it was tailored for the needs and expectations of a specific group, well, that's a slightly different question than whether culturally tailored interventions more broadly work or not. And of course, this is mostly a practice-based type of research where blinding per se is difficult, if not totally impossible. Clinicians are aware if they are providing the culturally tailored intervention or the standard one. Recipients are likely to see and hear culturally tailored images or phrases, even if they aren't able to compare what they are seeing and hearing to the standard intervention. What I found as I've gone through the research myself is that the more specific the review, whether on a single intervention or a set of interventions with a specific treatment goal, or with a single narrowly focused group, those results are routinely clear with less mixed results than those that try to include a broader mix of studies or aimed at a broader mix of groups. The top two of the bullet points presented on this slide are pulling facts from just such studies, although I could list dozens more. For example, the first bullet point comes from a study, Kim et al. From 2007, and it showed mixed results for tobacco cessation interventions across all Asian American groups. However, even in this study that shows mixed results, once you dig down into it, it seems it was more the types and intensity of the treatments that mattered more than any other factor. Looking at individual groups, cultural tailoring nearly always ended in higher success rates versus a standard intervention that wasn't culturally tailored. The study referenced in the bullet point is Wu et al. From 2012, and it focused specifically on culturally tailored motivational interviewing interventions for Chinese Americans and found that it doubled quit rates from 32% to 67%. Another study, Orleans et al. From 1998, found that providing the tailored Pathways to Freedom self-help guides to African American callers to a support line showed that those receiving the tailored materials found them to be more attractive than the standard materials. But in addition to simply being more attractive, they found them more trustworthy and more helpful. It led to more quit attempts at 6 months and more use of pre-quitting strategies. And in a 12-month opportunistic follow-up, they found a greater increase in long-term quits as well. Now, whether researchers are looking at Chinese Americans as in the study above or Asian Americans as in Kim et al., whether looking at African Americans using interactive voice technology or specific Native American tribes or the feasibility of even pan-tribal interventions, in all cases we have strong evidence that such interventions have greater effects than their non-tailored counterparts. Now this fourth bullet point is hard to accomplish, but it's nevertheless critical. Knowledge of specific culture-related barriers, prevalence rates, values, etc. should always be taken as guidelines, not rules. When I give this or related presentations live, I often ask for examples of concepts that clinicians should be aware of as they seek to find values that can help clients develop discrepancy between their desire to continue using tobacco and their desire to quit. And one common response is that Hispanics are Catholic and using their religious values may be helpful. They may be. I won't be saying not to do this. But it is worth pointing out that the level of atheism in the US is around 3%, and in Mexico, a bit over 4. To complicate this further, although a person from Mexico, to continue with this example, may be an atheist, they may still have attitudes, beliefs, and values that were formed by a dominant or within a dominant Catholic culture. They just may not express that value in religious terms. So if the person has defined values that resonate, the fact that Mexican culture is a Catholic one may be helpful to draw the target, but exploring whether this unique client is a Catholic or not will help you find the bullseye. Incorporating the addressing model developed by Pamela A. Hayes is a good strategy to help accomplish this bullet point, and I want to share it, but I want to share it with the same caveat that I just said. While culture provides individuals with a framework for their decision making and for the development of meaning, and while knowing what another person's cultural influences are can help us understand that person's behaviors and decisions, this type of knowledge should be taken with a grain of salt, or perhaps several grains. Individuals are always more than the sum of their cultural inputs. We'll get into this more as we go forward, but in the meantime, let me just say that I do appreciate the addressing model a lot. And I know that ADDRESSING, addressing, is a really long acronym to try and memorize, and I definitely don't have it memorized. But I think its length is part of its usefulness. It's a reminder that the client is not just Hispanic, not just lesbian, not just a woman, but is a complex person with many overlapping and likely contradicting cultural inputs. The active reminder of the complexity of an individual's identity also acts as a reminder that before drawing any conclusions about that individual, we should be exploring the diversity of their influences. This notion that an individual is an individual is an individual, something I have said and will continue to say, should not be taken to its extreme position either. The fact is that the effects of culture are large and, although invisible, real. People are products of their culture. I just want to emphasize that we are not merely the products of an outsider's version of our culture. Finally, I want to discuss the potential power of adopting a clinic-wide habit of using the MI, motivational interviewing model. This chart combines 3 things at once to provide an overall vision of how an interaction might work. In this simple model, ask and advise are short and familiar. Is the person a tobacco user? Followed by advice to quit if the client says they are. In both instances here, this interaction should be short and non-judgmental. No finger wagging or shaming. The first thing that is assessed during the assessment phase is the client's readiness to quit. Someone in pre-contemplation may need educational materials just to get them to consider quitting, and as we've already seen, those materials should be culturally and linguistically appropriate. A person in contemplation knows that tobacco is bad for them, and likely that using tobacco is in conflict with many of their personally held values. However, for whatever reason, they're not ready to quit right now. This person is primed for motivational interviewing. The clinician uses the assessment phase to explore the client's history of tobacco use as well as their current habits. This will include, at minimum, the questions on the heavy smoking index, as well as any other factors that may seem relevant. As the client moves into preparation, the clinician should help the client make concrete, achievable tobacco cessation goals. These goals will be made in light of the client's available resources, including the potential support of family members, religious groups, social groups, and more. In order to discover these, the clinician can use knowledge of the client's culture to guide the client to see the potential resources as sources of strength. Similarly, the client or the clinician will explore potential barriers with the client for achieving those goals. Some of these too may be cultural in nature. Prohibition against medication, exposure to ceremonial tobacco use, family dynamics well outside the power of the client in their culturally assigned roles. During the motivational interviewing, the clinician should use their knowledge of the client's culture to guide their questions as well as their recommendations for goals. In this case, the addressing model could come in handy as a guide for potential avenues to explore with the client to find those barriers and strengths. What's nice about motivational interviewing as a model is that it is client-focused. And so properly performed, it will be more difficult for the clinician's prejudices to interfere. I want to make clear I'm not thinking of MI as some sort of cultural magic bullet. To successfully overcome our implicit biases requires a lot of internal work, which I'll discuss in a moment, but a properly executed motivational interviewing session treats the individual with respect and empathy, regardless of their culture. It looks for the individual's values, regardless of their source, and helps the clinician develop intervention strategies that will work for the individual and takes into consideration the barriers that that individual is dealing with, regardless of whether or not those barriers have a cultural origin or not, although many of them will. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if a barrier has a cultural source or not. What matters the most is that it is a barrier for this client. And it matters if the client has the resources necessary to overcome that barrier during their cessation attempt. Similarly, it doesn't matter if the client's strength has a cultural source or not, as long as they have access to that strength during their cessation attempt. However, barriers with cultural weight are going to be harder to overcome, as their presence is likely to be more pervasive in the client's life, and because its cultural nature might make that barrier invisible to the client. The invisibility alone will make it harder to prepare the client for its potential effect. One non-racial ethnic way to think about this is to think about the presence of smoking advertisements. Very few people name the prevalence of billboards or point-of-sale marketing as a potential barrier of their quit attempt. And yet, as soon as they start their quit, they notice those advertisements everywhere, acting as a trigger to their cravings. Similarly, a person may not have even noticed the way that smoking plays a role in the dynamics of their social group. Giving up tobacco then alienates them from partaking in specific social activities, which may in turn carry broader cultural meaning for them than simply a way of hanging out with friends. Similarly, I said that whether or not a strength has a cultural source or not doesn't ultimately matter. But like barriers, this strength may be harder to recognize due to being embedded in the client's everyday life if it has a cultural source. And once discovered, it may turn out that its cultural origin provides a deeper sense of personal resonance and therefore also acts as a motivator in a way that a non-cultural resource simply cannot. At its core, the motivational interviewing heart set is based on certain attitudes that must be in place for one also to act in a culturally affirmative manner. These ideas are working together. At its very basic, simple prejudice is based on the fundamental notion that one's own culture is somehow superior to another's. Adopting an attitude of acceptance, in part, means getting rid of this belief. Similarly, the notion of a partnership entails accepting that client and clinician on many levels must be equals. Again, this runs contrary to notions of cultural superiority. One who harbors a sense of cultural superiority over one they are supposed to be caring for will naturally seek to direct them to the right solutions. There's a certain kind of paternalism involved in dictating that a person should change their behavior and that they should do it in a specific way. Motivational interviewing, properly performed, helps the clinician become aware of this dictating impulse and move them instead into the role of a caring guide, which of course is embodied in the compassionate attitude that shows up throughout MI. Up until now, I've been talking about about motivational interviewing approach as a method of treating clients with the appropriate level of cultural humility. However, it's equally true that diminishing our implicit biases becomes an integral part of being able to appropriately perform MI. Causality is running both ways. So it's worth considering the very basics of how we might be able to do that. The very first skill one needs to develop is being mindful of our assumptions, especially those that are provided by our cultural paradigm. We are as likely as our clients to be blind to our cultural influences. And let me provide one example, and it's a fairly common one. In some cultures, maintaining steady eye contact is considered disrespectful. In US society, steady eye contact is not only a sign of respect, it's also a sign of self-esteem and trustworthiness. When someone we are talking to fails to maintain eye contact, we have an immediate and invisible reaction that interprets that behavior the only way we've been taught to. At best, disrespectful. At worst, dishonest. That's not to suggest that any of you listening would ever naturally suspect that your client is lying to you. Rather, this immediate and invisible effect is typically one of unrealized discomfort, like a shadow in the room that alerts us that something is amiss, but we don't know what. And at that point, we may be hypersensitive to certain behaviors, speech patterns, etc., that can be used to help find a rationale for how we feel. If the feeling we have is a negative one, we will search the environment for confirmation and explanation for that negative feeling. And sometimes when we find it, sometimes we do find it, but having been primed to look for it increases the odds that the rationale we find is more reflective of our subjective inner state and not of the objective reality that surrounds us. It's impossible to provide a complete list of all cultures for which their rules of social engagement differ from all clinicians' cultures, although some cultural diversity training attempts they do attempt to provide such lists. In addition to sheer impracticability of such a method, the other problem is that the clinician isn't necessarily privy to the cultural heritage of the person walking through the door, and by the time it is assessed, the clinician has already begun making those initial judgments that will govern the interpretations of future behaviors. So I would stress that the important thing to do here is to assume the best of all clients, to make that the attitude. Assume clients are going to tell the truth about what ails them, about what they want from treatment, about the conditions that led them to seek care in the first place. Hold this belief for as long as possible, and if something keeps insisting that this isn't true, that something isn't clicking, that we're not getting our ideas across for some reason, go down the addressing checklist looking for potential cultural explanations for this discrepancy. On exposure to other cultures, the more a clinician can associate with people of different backgrounds, the more easily they will notice their own cultural predilections. And at the same time, much of our biases are built by simple discomfort, as the kind I already described. We may be unaware that talking to someone who exhibits speech patterns that are alien to us make us uncomfortable. It resides at a sub-threshold level, but it may show up in our behaviors. We may, for example, refuse to maintain eye contact with someone who doesn't maintain it with us. Or we may overly concentrate on the lack of eye contact and try to initiate it. In either case, we're not being fully aware of the client's other body language acts that may contain clues to their condition. Or we may shorten the time we spend with a client who stands closer to us than our culture has prepared us for. Of course, data collection can help us with some of these things, but not all of them. Simply getting used to these differences and understanding that they are different things and not worse things can help us to overcome the negative impact that discomfort may have on our ability to serve. Be aware of the role of confirmation bias. Being proven right feels good, and we are always on the lookout for ways to confirm what we already believe, even when the so-called truth doesn't correspond to objectively observable reality. And of course, this naturally goes in hand with the first point. Finally, remain curious. It doesn't matter how much exposure a clinician has to many cultures, there's always more to learn. We are never truly culturally competent. I'm still learning things every day about US culture, as I'm sure all you are. It is extremely unlikely that any of us will be the undisputed masters of someone else's unique mix of cultural influences. There are always individual differences to be on the lookout for. And just as we want clinicians to exhibit all these great qualities, the fact is that it is a partnership. It is about mutual respect. It is about mutual trust. Just as we ask a clinician to be empathetic and accepting of differences, in my experiences, showing that you're willing to do these things is the best method of eliciting that behavior in return from our clients. And in that regard, the best thing we can do is show them that we're taking in the words they're saying, that we're listening to them, and that we're hearing them. And finally, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about what constitutes a culturally tailored intervention. I know this seems really late in the game to finally bring this up, but we've talked a lot about making sure the knowledge and attitudes of the clinician are aimed in the right direction. And to the extent that prejudices may still enter the equation, we've talked about using data and supervisory accountability to detect and respond to persistent gaps in the provision of care. Since the purpose of the Build a Clinic program is to help clinics analyze and adjust their current workflows, changes in attitudes and practices are the appropriate focus for this presentation. However, bringing in pieces like posters, quick kits, self-help brochures, and educational materials are also appropriate supports for clients, and to the extent that they should be tailored culturally, what are we looking for? Well, the first thing I want to say is that whenever possible, care for these communities should come from within. If you're in a position to make connections within certain neighborhoods, look to the spiritual and other leaders within those communities as allies. If possible, fellow community members should provide the tobacco cessation services themselves. For example, tobacco cessation groups. Naturally, this is hard to do and requires a lot of legwork. Failing that, the next step is to hire staff that reflect the diversity of the community that your clinic serves. And supplementing staff with the use of peers is also highly advisable. Hispanic Latino communities and some Asian American communities have demonstrated a lot of success with the use of lay health navigators, promotoras, and similar. Obviously, at some point, this may become impractical. Some communities have dozens and dozens, even hundreds of potential groups in its catchment area. But in all cases, materials and the modality of the intervention itself should be responsive to the needs of the community. But this does not always mean appealing to the cultural values of a specific group. And I know that sounds weird given the emphasis on values throughout this presentation. But for example, in one style of intervention, making an additional outbound phone call using interactive voice technology, so not even a human on the other end, but a sort of a computerized message, increased the amount of African American smokers who had left the quit line to re-enroll. There's nothing in any textbook about African American culture that would indicate that interactive voice technology would be particularly effective with African American smokers, but it was responsive to the needs in that community. And that's sort of what we're aiming at here. So connecting smokers to quit line coaches who share the language or understand the norms of the culture has been repeatedly shown to be an effective model because it diminishes the sense that the clinician is not like the caller and raises medical trust. And that seems to follow from the first bullet point, but it also works in these communities because using the quit line is something that can be done with more privacy than a trip to a counselor, which can help with communities that have a greater sense of shame surrounding the need for behavioral health care, or have a greater sense of personal failure surrounding their inability to simply walk away from nicotine. We've already talked about the need to plug into a client's values. This is important regardless of whether those values have cultural resonance. And when working with individuals in a one-on-one setting, we can sort of suss this out. However, in the design of educational or instructional materials, they have to be aimed more broadly to the values that are known to be held commonly within a group. But if you have the resources to perform focus groups composed of members of the community that you hope to engage with, that's a way more reliable way of ensuring that you're designing materials that will have that impact. And that's also a really great way of finding out how we can change the modality of an intervention without necessarily making it, designing it culturally, so to speak, but really aiming at very specific communities. And we want to use images, language, and an overall graphic design that appeals to the groups you're working with. Whenever possible, utilizing members of the community to develop those materials, or to at least help develop those materials, is a good idea because it's actually very hard to overcome our natural aesthetic preferences when we are designing materials for a cultural group that we're not a member of. As always, I do want to take a brief moment to note that we have several resources for download on our site, the two most relevant of which are the Dimensions Tobacco-Free Toolkit for Healthcare Providers and a Patient-Centered Tobacco Cessation Workflow for Healthcare Clinics. Like all of our toolkits, many of which are also available in Spanish, they're freely downloadable. Just look on our website under which is bhwellness.org. Look under the Resources tab under Toolkits. For those of you interested in applying for the next round of the Build a Clinic program, please check our page. The next round will be beginning shortly. In addition to these public webinars, we also provide tailored technical assistance to a limited number of selected applicants. Requests for applications will be going out soon, and if you want to be included in that RFA mailing, please just email us and let us know. And you can email us right here. And with that, I will open it up for questions.